The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's quiet streets when Sarah Chen collapsed in her kitchen, clutching her throat as foam spilled from her lips. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, found her 3 hours later when she came to borrow sugar for her afternoon baking. The paramedics who arrived at the scene had never witnessed anything quite like it. Sarah's body was rigid, her face twisted in an expression of pure agony, and the distinctive smell of bitter almonds hung heavy in the air. Detective Michael Rodriguez had been working cases in Millbrook for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw that Tuesday morning. The small town of 8,000 residents was known for its annual apple festival and the occasional teenage prank, not mysterious deaths. As he examined Sarah's modest two-bedroom home, everything appeared normal except for the half-empty cup of coffee sitting on the kitchen counter. The liquid inside had an unusual greenish tint that made his stomach turn. The coroner, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, arrived within the hour. She was a woman in her 60s who had seen everything during her 30-year career, but even she seemed unsettled by Sarah's condition. The preliminary examination suggested poisoning, though the exact substance remained unknown. Sarah had been a beloved kindergarten teacher at Millbrook Elementary, known for her kindness and her weekly volunteer work at the local animal shelter. She had no known enemies, no complicated relationships, and lived a quiet life with her 2 cats. News of Sarah's death spread through the town like wildfire. By evening, clusters of residents gathered on street corners, whispering theories and sharing their shock. Sarah had been planning to marry her longtime boyfriend, David Morrison, in just 3 months. The wedding invitations had already been sent, and she had spent the previous weekend shopping for her dress with her best friend, Rebecca Hall. The thought that someone could have deliberately ended her life seemed impossible to the tight-knit community. David Morrison was questioned extensively, though he had a solid alibi. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage and had been fixing Mrs. Thompson's sedan all morning, with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. His grief appeared genuine, and he broke down several times during the interview, clutching Sarah's engagement ring and begging the police to find whoever had done this to the woman he loved. The investigation team found no evidence linking him to the crime, and his background check revealed nothing suspicious. As the evening wore on, Detective Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something about the calculated nature of the poisoning suggested a level of planning that went beyond a crime of passion. The killer had chosen a method that was both cruel and cowardly, striking at someone who posed no threat to anyone. The detective requested additional support from the state police, sensing that Millbrook was about to face something far worse than a single tragic death. His instincts, honed by years of experience, told him that Sarah Chen's murder was not an isolated incident, and the killer was still among them. 3 days after Sarah's funeral, the nightmare returned to Millbrook with devastating force. Margaret Sullivan, a 62-year-old librarian who had worked at the town library for over 20 years, was found dead in her garden by her teenage grandson, Tommy. The boy had come to help her plant roses for the spring season, a tradition they had shared since he was 8 years old. When he arrived that Saturday morning, he discovered his grandmother lying among her prized tomato plants, her body contorted in the same horrific manner as Sarah Chen. The similarities between the 2 deaths were impossible to ignore. Margaret's face bore the same expression of agony, and the bitter almond scent was even stronger in her garden. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the scene within minutes of receiving the call, his worst fears confirmed. The killer had struck again, and this time there was no doubt that Millbrook was dealing with a serial poisoner. The state police immediately increased their presence in the town, and FBI agents were called in to assist with the investigation. Dr. Warren performed the autopsy on Margaret with extra precautions, wearing full protective gear as she examined the body. The toxicology results for Sarah had just come back, revealing the presence of cyanide in lethal doses. The poison had been administered through her morning coffee, mixed with a substance that masked its natural bitter taste. Margaret's preliminary examination suggested the same cause of death, though the delivery method appeared different. There were no obvious signs of how the poison had entered her system, creating a new puzzle for the investigation team. Margaret had been a pillar of the community, known for organizing the annual book drive and teaching literacy classes for adults. She lived alone since her husband's death 5 years earlier, but maintained close relationships with her 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Her daily routine was predictable. She opened the library at 8 each morning, tended to her garden in the afternoons, and spent evenings reading mystery novels on her front porch. The idea that someone would target such a harmless, beloved woman sent shockwaves through the already terrified community. The connection between Sarah and Margaret was not immediately obvious. They attended different churches, shopped at different stores, and moved in different social circles despite the town's small size. Sarah was 34 and single until recently, while Margaret was a widow with grown children. The only clear link was their gender and their status as well-respected community members. This realization brought a new level of fear to Millbrook, as residents began to wonder who might be next and what criteria the killer was using to select victims. By Sunday evening, the town was in a state of panic. Hardware stores sold out of security systems and door locks within hours. Many residents, particularly women living alone, packed bags and went to stay with relatives in neighboring towns. The local diner, which normally buzzed with conversation and laughter, sat nearly empty as people avoided public spaces. Church attendance dropped dramatically, and even the weekly farmers' market was canceled due to safety concerns. The killer had succeeded in terrorizing an entire community, and the worst part was that no one knew where or when the next attack might come. The investigation intensified as federal agents established a command center in the abandoned Millbrook department store. Agent Jennifer Hayes, a seasoned profiler with 20 years of experience hunting serial killers, took charge of the case. She immediately noticed patterns that local law enforcement had missed. Both victims had been found in the morning hours, both had died alone, and both had been discovered by people who cared about them. The killer seemed to take pleasure not just in ending lives, but in ensuring that loved ones would be traumatized by the discovery. Agent Hayes ordered a comprehensive review of both women's activities in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Security cameras from local businesses were collected and analyzed, phone records were examined, and every person who had interacted with Sarah and Margaret was interviewed. The investigation revealed that both women had visited the same grocery store, Millbrook Market, within 48 hours of their deaths. They had also both attended the town council meeting the previous month, where heated discussions about a proposed shopping complex had dominated the agenda. The grocery store connection proved particularly interesting when investigators discovered that both women had purchased items from the same display of organic honey that had been set up near the entrance. The honey was produced by a local beekeeper named Harold Brennan, who had been supplying the store for 3 years. When agents visited Harold's property on the outskirts of town, they found a nervous man in his 50s who lived alone with dozens of beehives scattered across his 20-acre farm. His behavior during questioning was erratic, and he seemed to know more about the victims than a casual acquaintance should. Harold's background check revealed a troubled past that had been hidden from his neighbors. He had served time in prison 15 years earlier for assault with a deadly weapon, though the details of the case were sealed because it involved a domestic violence incident. After his release, he had moved to Millbrook to start fresh, establishing his beekeeping business and generally keeping to himself. Neighbors described him as quiet and strange, noting that he rarely spoke to anyone and became agitated when people walked too close to his property. The connection to the honey created a new theory about how the poison was being delivered. Cyanide could easily be mixed with honey, masking both its smell and taste while providing a sweet delivery method that victims would consume willingly. The investigation team immediately tested all remaining jars of Harold's honey from the grocery store, but the results came back negative for any toxic substances. This created a puzzling contradiction that forced agents to consider whether Harold was the killer or simply an unfortunate coincidence in the case. As agents continued to investigate Harold's background, they discovered that he had been present at several community events where both victims had also been in attendance. He had sold honey at the farmers' market where Sarah often shopped, and he had made a delivery to the library just days before Margaret's death. Security footage from the library showed Harold entering through the back door, ostensibly to drop off honey for the staff break room. The timing of his visit, combined with his criminal history and connection to both victims, made him the primary suspect in what was quickly becoming the most shocking crime in Millbrook's history. Officer Jake Stevens had always trusted his German Shepherd Rex more than most people. The 8-year-old dog had been his partner for 5 years, and their bond went beyond the typical relationship between a handler and a canine unit. Rex had an uncanny ability to detect things that escaped human senses, from hidden drugs to explosives, and his track record was nearly perfect. When Agent Hayes requested that all available resources be deployed to search Harold Brennan's property, Officer Stevens and Rex were among the first to respond. The search warrant for Harold's farm was executed at dawn on a cold Tuesday morning. Harold appeared cooperative, though his hands shook visibly as he watched agents systematically examine his modest farmhouse and the surrounding outbuildings. He denied any involvement in the deaths and insisted that his honey was pure and safe. When asked about his visits to locations frequented by both victims, he claimed they were routine business deliveries and nothing more. His explanations seemed plausible, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was hiding important information. Rex began showing signs of agitation as soon as they arrived at the property. The dog's behavior was unusual, different from his normal excitement during searches. Instead of his typical methodical approach, Rex seemed anxious and kept returning to the same area near an old storage shed at the back of the property. Officer Stevens had learned to read his partner's body language over the years, and Rex's insistent focus on the shed raised immediate red flags. The building appeared unremarkable from the outside, weathered and partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. Inside the shed, agents discovered Harold's beekeeping equipment, including dozens of empty honey jars, protective suits, and various tools for maintaining the hives. Everything appeared normal until Rex began pawing frantically at a loose floorboard in the corner. When agents pried up the board, they found a hidden compartment containing items that made their blood run cold. There were detailed photographs of both Sarah Chen and Margaret Sullivan, taken without their knowledge as they went about their daily routines. The images showed the women shopping, working, and walking through town, suggesting that Harold had been stalking them for weeks before their deaths. The hidden compartment also contained a detailed journal written in Harold's handwriting. The entries revealed a disturbed mind obsessed with what he perceived as the perfect women of Millbrook. He had been watching Sarah and Margaret for months, learning their habits and routines with the dedication of a predator. The journal contained detailed plans for their murders, including experiments with different methods of poison delivery and notes about the most effective doses of cyanide. Most chilling of all were the entries about his future targets, with names and addresses of 6 other women in the town. As agents continued to examine the contents of the hidden compartment, they discovered the smoking gun that would seal Harold's fate. At the bottom of the space was a small glass vial containing traces of cyanide, along with detailed instructions for extracting the poison from bitter almonds and other natural sources. There were also receipts for various chemicals and equipment purchased under false names from suppliers in neighboring states. The evidence painted a clear picture of a methodical killer who'd been planning his crimes for months, using his beekeeping business as a cover for his sinister activities. Officer Stevens watched as Harold was placed under arrest, while Rex sat calmly beside him, his job well done. The arrest of Harold Brennan sent shockwaves through Millbrook, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than relief, the discovery of his journal and the list of potential victims created a new wave of terror that was even worse than before. The 6 women named in his writings included prominent community members, the bank manager, the high school principal, a local nurse, the mayor's wife, a young mother who ran the daycare center, and the elderly woman who organized charity drives for the homeless. Each of these women had been photographed and studied, their routines documented with frightening precision. Agent Hayes immediately ordered protective custody for all the women on Harold's list. But the damage to the community's psyche had already been done. The realization that a killer had been living among them for 3 years, watching and planning, shattered any sense of security the residents had ever felt. Parents kept their children home from school. Businesses closed early, and the normally bustling town square became a ghost town. Even after Harold's arrest, people whispered that he might have accomplices or that copycat killers could emerge from the shadows. During his interrogation, Harold displayed a disturbing mix of pride and detachment when discussing his crimes. He spoke about Sarah and Margaret as if they were specimens in an experiment rather than human beings with families and dreams. When asked why he had chosen them, he explained his twisted logic with chilling calm. He believed that women like Sarah and Margaret represented everything that was pure and good in the world, and by killing them, he was preserving their perfection before age, and disappointment could corrupt them. His warped philosophy revealed a mind completely disconnected from reality and human empathy. The investigation into Harold's background revealed a pattern of escalating violence that had gone unnoticed for years. Former neighbors from his previous town reported instances of missing pets and dead birds found on their property. After disputes with Harold, his ex-wife, who had been granted a restraining order before his imprisonment, described years of psychological abuse and threats. She had tried to warn authorities when Harold was released from prison, but her concerns were dismissed as the paranoia of a bitter ex-spouse. Her warnings, if taken seriously, might have prevented the tragedies in Millbrook. The forensic evidence against Harold was overwhelming. Traces of cyanide were found in his workshop, along with detailed notes about dosages and delivery methods. His fingerprints were discovered on items in both victims' homes, including Sarah's coffee cup and a jar of honey found in Margaret's kitchen. Phone records showed that he had made anonymous calls to both women in the days before their deaths, hanging up when they answered. Security footage from various locations around town captured him following both women, confirming the stalking behavior documented in his journal. As news of the evidence spread, the people of Millbrook struggled to process how they had been so completely deceived. Harold had seemed like an odd but harmless hermit, someone to be pitied rather than feared. He had attended community events, sold his products at local markets, and even donated honey to church fundraisers. The mask he had worn was so convincing that even his closest neighbors, who lived just miles away, had never suspected the monster hiding beneath his quiet exterior. The betrayal of trust cut deep, leaving residents questioning their ability to judge character and wondering who else among them might be hiding dark secrets. The trial of Harold Brennan became a media sensation that attracted reporters from across the country to the small town of Millbrook. The courthouse, which normally handled traffic violations and property disputes, was transformed into a fortress with metal detectors and armed guards. Residents lined up for hours to secure seats in the gallery, desperate to see justice served for Sarah and Margaret. The proceedings revealed details so disturbing that several jurors required counseling to cope with the evidence presented. Harold's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Robert Martinez, faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and Harold's own journal contained detailed confessions to both murders. The defense strategy focused on mental illness, arguing that Harold's troubled childhood and previous head injuries had created a psychotic break from reality. Expert witnesses testified about his history of abuse, social isolation, and the gradual deterioration of his mental state over the years. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Harold's crimes were methodical and premeditated, showing clear awareness of right and wrong. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the coroner who had performed both autopsies. She described in clinical detail how cyanide had ravaged the victims' bodies, causing excruciating pain and terror in their final moments. She explained that Harold had deliberately chosen a poison that would cause maximum suffering, rejecting faster-acting alternatives that would have been more humane. The prosecutor used this evidence to argue for the death penalty, stating that Harold's crimes demonstrated exceptional cruelty that warranted the ultimate punishment. Family members of both victims gave heart-wrenching victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. David Morrison, Sarah's fiancé, spoke about the wedding they would never have and the children they would never raise together. Margaret's daughter described how her mother's brutal death had traumatized her teenage son, who blamed himself for not arriving at his grandmother's house earlier that fateful morning. The ripple effects of Harold's crimes extended far beyond the two women he had killed, destroying the peace and happiness of entire families. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of stalking and terroristic threats. When the verdict was read, Harold showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, stating that Harold's crimes were among the most heinous he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The courtroom erupted in applause though many families felt that no punishment could ever truly balance the scales of justice. During the sentencing phase, additional evidence emerged that painted an even darker picture of Harold's activities. Investigators had discovered that he had been experimenting with different poisons for years, using stray animals as test subjects to perfect his methods. Veterinarians in neighboring towns reported mysterious animal deaths that, in retrospect, bore the hallmarks of Harold's handiwork. The scope of his cruelty extended beyond human victims, revealing a complete absence of empathy for any living creature. This information reinforced the judge's decision and provided closure for a community that had struggled to understand how such evil could have existed in their midst. 5 years have passed since Harold Brennan was sentenced to life in prison, but the town of Millbrook has never fully recovered from the trauma he inflicted. The physical scars have healed, but the psychological wounds remain open for many residents. The house where Harold lived has been demolished, and the land where his beehives once stood has been turned into a memorial garden for Sarah and Margaret. Despite these efforts to move forward, the community continues to struggle with the knowledge that they had unknowingly harbored a killer for 3 years. Officer Jake Stevens and Rex became local heroes after their discovery of the hidden evidence that sealed Harold's conviction. Rex received numerous awards from law enforcement organizations, and his story was featured in national magazines about police dogs. However, Stevens noticed changes in his partner after the case. Rex became more protective and anxious, as if he could sense dangers that others missed. The dog's behavior served as a constant reminder of the evil they had uncovered, and Stevens often wondered if Rex understood the magnitude of what they had found that day. The 6 women who had been on Harold's target list struggled with survivors' guilt and paranoia for years after the trial. Despite receiving counseling and protection, they found it difficult to return to normal life knowing how close they had come to becoming victims. Several moved away from Millbrook, unable to walk the streets where Harold had stalked them. Those who remained formed a support group that met monthly, helping each other cope with the lasting effects of being hunted by a killer. Their experiences highlighted how Harold's crimes had victimized far more people than just Sarah and Margaret. The Millbrook Market, where both victims had purchased Harold's honey, closed permanently 6 months after the trial. The owners, Tom and Linda Foster, couldn't bear the guilt of having unknowingly facilitated the murders by selling Harold's products. They had trusted him as a supplier for 3 years, never suspecting that he was using their store as a hunting ground. The empty building became a symbol of the town's lost innocence, a reminder of how trust and community spirit had been weaponized by a predator. Detective Michael Rodriguez retired early, unable to shake the images of what Harold had done to Sarah and Margaret. He moved to Florida with his wife, seeking distance from the case that had consumed his final years in law enforcement. In interviews years later, he admitted that Harold's ability to blend into the community while planning such horrific crimes had shattered his faith in his ability to protect people. He credited Officer Stevens and Rex with solving the case, acknowledging that traditional detective work might never have uncovered the hidden evidence that proved Harold's guilt. Today, Millbrook is a changed place. Security systems are standard in every home, and residents remain wary of strangers in ways that were unthinkable before Harold's crimes. The annual Apple Festival was canceled permanently, and many community events that once brought people together have never resumed. Children who were young during Harold's reign of terror are now teenagers who grew up with an understanding that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. The town's motto, "Where neighbors become family," was quietly removed from the welcome sign, replaced with nothing at all. The story of Harold Brennan serves as a chilling reminder that monsters can live among us, hiding behind masks of normalcy while harboring the darkest intentions. The heroic work of Officer Stevens and Rex prevented additional murders and brought justice for Sarah and Margaret, but the cost to the community was immeasurable. Millbrook learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear harmless, and that trust, once broken by such betrayal, may never fully heal. The fear that Harold created lives on, a permanent shadow over a town that once believed itself immune to such evil.